When we think about what disabled people might know about sexual abuse or sexual assault, it's almost impossible to generalise, because people with disabilities actually consist of many different communities of people with different impairments. We've got people like myself with a vision impairment, that could be low vision or blindness, or other sensory impairments, hearing impairment through to deafness. People with physical and mobility impairments that might alter the way that they manoeuvre, or it could be represented by a physical appearance, difference in their appearance. It might be a learning disability, the way that they learn and remember information, or it could be people with a chronic health condition that is affecting them intermittently. So we have people with disabilities who have grown up with that impairment and have come through their whole life with this identity, and others who possibly even as a result of some kind of violence may have acquired impairments later in life. We see that actually people with injuries to their eyes may well have been a result of violence, and that can be an additional layer to how they deal with the trauma that they've experienced. I think the important thing to say is that disabled people are like all others in the community. They have the same range of views about the causes and consequences of sexual abuse or assault. The layers that we know exist in society about gender and cultural views. There are disabled people of all sorts of different sexual identities and orientations, and have the same risk, I suppose, of perpetuating bystanding behaviours. Possibly even more so, because when you're in a position where you are aware of heightened vulnerability, you're less likely to get involved. And to get involved in someone else's business would be to face the reality that you are possibly more at risk of putting yourself in danger as well. So what we know about the way that people think about people with disabilities is that there are already some really strong social narratives around disabled people. We know that quite often they're seen as people who are sick or who are unwell and who need some kind of treatment and healthcare to restore them to some better place of well-being. So as a starting point, that's putting people with disabilities in another category. And it is putting people in other categories that blocks us from being able to relate to them and relate to their experiences. Equally so, throughout history, disabled people have been seen as people who are weaker or in more need and need more assistance. And of course, these identities have also become internalized for disabled people. Because if this is the way that the world treats you, is that you are unwell or that you need help, or that you are what is called a super crip, you have overcome challenges and you are fantastic for simply doing everyday tasks, you yourself start to believe these things, these ways of thinking about having an impairment. And this is kind of an oppressive way of being, oppressed in the community by these narratives that exist. And of course, disabled people don't know anything more about sexual abuse, sexual assault than anybody else in the community. There's a notion that it's an unknown problem, or it's certainly not a problem that is discussed. One of the challenges that disabled survivors face is that there's this idea that disabled people are non-sexual beings. To the extent that disabled people are sterilised from an early age so that their reproductive abilities are not preserved. And even further, that disabled people are seen as good candidates for euthanasia, that there is a right to life and a right to create life that is not bestowed to disabled people because they are broken or sick or unwell or not capable of these things. We have laws that classify disabled people as vulnerable adults. This label is stigmatizing. There are laws that govern disabled people's capacity to make decisions and to own property. These are powerful guidelines for all of society in the way to think about disability. At no point are we ever just considered to be equal citizens with particular support needs. What disabled people say matters most to them are equal rights of citizenship and the opportunity to participate. We are starting from a really low base of lack of awareness of the occurrence of sexual violence and lack of awareness of what services exist to support survivors. So when a person does need that support, of critical importance is knowing that they can actually contact crisis services and they can actually get help. Knowing that those services will operate in a way that won't impede them getting the help that they need. And knowing that there will be information that they can access, that's the necessary information that they need to access to use those services, they will be able to access that information. And that any help that they need to use the service and get the critical support they need as survivors, they will be able to access that. Knowing that they can actually have safe travel into facilities and throughout those facilities is critical. Knowing that the staff will be trained to support them in appropriate ways. I think what people want is to be respected as a whole person with all of their needs, that people will appreciate what some of the situations are that disabled people are in and how that leads to different forms of abuse and violence. For example, with families and caregivers, disabled people may lose access to the personal support in practical terms or in funding in order to reach a safe environment. I think what matters most is that there will be positive, welcoming attitudes that ensure that people will be included in the decisions and in the services that are provided, that staff will ask questions rather than knowing the answers. Physical access to facilities is very important. Being able to communicate with phone-based services, or if the contact channel for a service is to first phone the service, to be able to communicate with them in appropriate ways. Having different support, not more support, but different way of working, flexibility, maybe more time, it may be having information in plain language, it may be engaging with interpreters. Within the disability community there are, of course, smaller subsets. The deaf community is one demographic who are able to operate almost autonomously because they have their own language, they have their own culture, they have their own meeting places and social networks that exist almost in isolation from the hearing world and the rest of the disability community. So within deaf community, there will be occurrence of abuse and violence that is not spoken about for a range of reasons. One reason is a certain distrust on the part of deaf people about hearing services that do not cater for their needs. So why would they ever access them? And who would they even report to? In the deaf community, there's a particular issue with needing to use New Zealand Sign Language interpreters to access hearing services. And of course, the very small pool of interpreters that deaf people have to rely on, that can create a challenge in terms of confidentiality and safety, and it can close off one of the avenues that someone might otherwise use to get support. A lot of disabled people's lives are in some way controlled by professionals and organisations. These organisations support disabled people to live independent lives, but they also make disabled people subject to their policies and their contractual requirements and the services that they must deliver in the way they must deliver them. So disability services do not have great awareness of what services exist for survivors and are not required to share that information with their clients. It can be a very challenging situation for a disabled person to be in, to know that the service that delivers a lot of their support will not have, in many cases, any answers or any idea of who to refer to. So they'll need to look elsewhere for the answers that they're seeking. I think that disability abuse is a hidden issue, and I think that it's hidden because a lot of people will assume that it either does not happen or that where it does happen, someone somewhere is responsible for making sure that it doesn't happen and keeping disabled people safe, because they need to be kept safe by others. So there's a lack of belief in the personal power of a person with disabilities to keep themselves safe. And again, this is one of the things that disabled people start to internalize, that they don't have the authority or ability to protect themselves. There is also this other idea that disabled people are hypersexual. It's a complete opposite scenario where because they are different, they're a curiosity, and people are attracted to things that they do not usually expect to see, and they become an object of interest. And I say object intentionally because this is part of the inspiration narrative that disabled people are they are a tool to make people feel better about their own lives. And these are, look, to be clear, people are raised with beliefs about disability that have been passed down through generations. We know that people who work in sexual violence services have the best intentions for people and for their well-being, and at the same time can unknowingly bring attitudes that were forged in a different time and may well not be aware of the way that disabled people live their everyday lives. And this is totally understandable. While we have 1.1 million disabled people in New Zealand, the day-to-day interaction with a disabled person may not feel very common for a lot of people, because disability is diverse, because it can be hidden, because it is not distributed evenly in society, and because people are not often in the public view. Especially a visible disability does open you up to potential risk. And disabled people, especially those who have been living with that very visible difference their whole lives, will be well aware that they are at risk, and will live with this latent fear at all times, perhaps not even consciously anymore. So, as I've said, disability can be a risk for violence, and it can also be a result of violence. So we need to bear in mind that not only could we be interacting with a survivor, but we could be interacting with a newly disabled person, a person who has been brought up with a lot of the social narratives around ability as powerful, ability as the right way, the correct way, and thrust into the world of being disabled and having to come to terms with that change in function along with the trauma of the abuse itself. A service will feel safe and will bring safety if they show that they are anticipating that disabled people experience sexual assault or abuse. They can do this through planning for meeting the needs of disabled people, incorporating those additional costs that they need to do so into their funding proposals, and consulting and getting advice from disabled people. Frontline crisis support workers can assist by being aware, becoming aware, and becoming comfortable with people who look and sound and interact in different ways. They can examine their own judgments about difference and disability. Frontline workers can help to set up the support that's provided so that the individual can be as independent as possible, that the support is always grounded in the will and preferences of the disabled person, and it's not organised solely based on the specialist views of non-disabled professionals. Disabled people's call to action has always been nothing about us without us. But of course, we are part of society, we are equal citizens, so it is really a case of it being everything with us.